Hello everyone. Thank you so much for being here. My name is Giannella Ysasi Tavano. I'm a museum educator, arts administrator, art historian, and dancer. And today I'm going to talk about a research I worked on as a Women's Sport Fellow at the Learning and Public Engagement Department at the Art Institute of Chicago. And which have prompted me to think about the various types of language, text, image, body, etc., that can be used to create meaningful experiences in the museum space. This research was originally planned to have a practicum component, which has been postponed due to COVID-19. Nonetheless, this presentation, I'm going to present a compilation of case studies, research, interviews, and some recommendations that I've titled Developing Practices to Support Bilingual Experiences at the Museum. This research was inspired by a real need that educators at the Art Institute are often faced upon, and more specifically our summer interns in the Learning and Public Engagement Department, whose main responsibility revolved around planning and giving public tours, and who ultimately interact with a number of bilingual families and multi-generational audiences during the summertime. Therefore, with this context in mind, I'm going to start this presentation. Because objects of art are expressive, they are a language. Language exists only when it is listened to as well as spoken. The hearer is an indispensable partner. The work of art is complete only as it works in the experience of other than the one who created it. So this quote by John Dewey is a good starting point to think about how a museum as an informed educational space can potentially transcend barriers of language when it comes to meaning making, and it becomes a space for creativity, inquiry, and inherent multiculturalism. So some questions that inspired this research project included: what are the barriers of English-only experiences in the museum? How can educators create sustained practices that support bilingual or even multilingual approaches to facilitate the emergence of visitors' voices and truly convey the values of a visitor-centered museum? And how does a museum create relevance through acknowledging and embracing multiple languages? And how to embrace access, diversity, and inclusion through in-gallery teaching practices that think about language inclusion and language access. So the research methods that I used was a literature review, of both bilingual teaching and interpretation in museums, as well as a set of case studies and experiences from other museums that have been, how they have been developing, implementing, and sometimes even evaluating those programs. In addition, I conducted interviews to our summer interns to just get a sense of the things that were actually happening in the museum and that we needed to address. In particular, these questions from our interns came from the partnership that we have with the Chicago Public Libraries. These groups often come with bilingual audiences that only speak English or only speak Spanish, or families that speak both languages, or that have different level of proficiency, or that even it varies among the generations that come in. So it became clear that there was an opportunity to create techniques for them to feel comfortable, for both the facilitators and the audiences to feel comfortable, and most importantly, to successfully deliver an experience which was meaningful for all. So some of the challenges that come into play when engaging with multi-generational bilingual visitors include the proficiency of English, the power dynamics among generations, and maybe even the discomfort of entering a space that you're not familiar with, that in this case is a museum. So in Chicago, the case for Hispanic and Latino communities is relevant, particularly because it's one of the biggest populations that it's in our city. They don't necessarily are coming through our doors, but that definitely is in our city. And in this summer program, they come through our doors. And here you can see the great amount of people that live in the city, in which we are hopefully creating relevant experiences, or want to create relevant experiences for them. So the topic on bilingualism or multilingualism in museums can become overwhelming when we think about capacity building, sustainability, language choice. So some questions are about the cost, about why we're choosing Spanish over other languages. Um, how what do we do if we don't have bilingual educators? Why do we do it now? How do we engage with that collection that might not be representative of the groups we're trying to engage with? So in this regard, I believe that the insight from an article about bilingual co-teaching strategies from school tours at the Blanton Museum of Art is very accurate when thinking about moving beyond translation and prioritizing on actually understanding the audience. Communities are ever-changing and constantly readapting. Therefore, museums and institutions should embrace the discomfort of transformation to remain relevant. Indeed, there is a great need to situate the topic of language in organizational decisions making and how it can deepen organizational learning and cultural competency. Nonetheless, I found that existing values that we were already embracing at the Art Institute and more specifically in the Learning and Public Engagement Department are core principles that can ground the possibilities of including language as an important consideration to create cultural relevance in the museum space. These include a visitor-centered approach, cultural competence, accessibility, and inclusion. So visitor-centered approach. I use some quotes from our interns to bring in their voices as well as the actual practicalities and the way this is playing out in the museum. So you can see some of these while I'm talking about the different values. So in regards to fostering a visitor-centered approach, language can be understood as an embodiment of culture, closely tied to building identity and community. There is an important consideration in regards to social-emotional learning when it comes to language. It can be loaded with stereotypes, even with problems with issues of discrimination, in which if the museum makes an effort to provide positive experience to non-English speakers, there's a sense of care and purpose that builds stronger engagement. In this sense, language also comes in when thinking about access, equity, and inclusion. How does a museum, as an informal space of education, can become a catalyst to empower audiences' identity through and with language? Raul Manzano's study on language, community, and translations multilingual exhibitions in art museums in New York City explained that the minority groups whose lack of political and social participation in critical decisions has excluded themselves from recognition. So it is here where culture and language become synonyms in the representation of these groups. Aligning with the definition provided by the school programs in the Department of Learning and Public Engagement here at the Art Institute, this definition of cultural competence as an educator's ability to embrace all participants' culturally grounded experiences, making these central to the experience. So this is a good principle to think about considering, uncovering, and rethinking the power dynamics and unspoken assumptions on decisions around language. As an article on linguistic colonialism that I found online by Anna Carradi in the Brown Political Review, she says, and I open quote, "Language can be an addition in the preservation of cultures and to a naturally evolving culture's array of nuances." Or another text on performance studies by Richard Schreschner, professor at NYU, which says that, I open quotes, language marks identity, spends time, reshapes and adorns the body, tells stories. It is about learning appropriate, culturally specific bits of behavior, or adjusting and performing one's life in relation to social and personal circumstances. And I close quotes. So we can see here in this quotes from our interns, it's not only about like promoting belonging to the audience, but even to our interns and the people who are inside the museum sharing their knowledge and their work. Following all of these principles, bilingual experiences comes down to giving the audience the freedom to choose whichever language they prefer to engage with during their visit. again at the Blanton Museum of Art, on thinking about their bilingual programs with school programs. They ask, how does the museum space affect the language choice of its audience? And they support the idea of a museum as a site for social interaction and cultural knowledges that holds the potential for visitors to discover, redefine, and affirm who they are. More than just words, language choices in the museum can critically engage visitors' cultural identities in their process of becoming. So as you can see, language is also performed. And to think about how to improve engagement with bilingual communities and visitors, I looked into existing bilingual and multilingual programs and initiatives in other museums here in the States. And the big question was, how does language reflect back to visitors' lived experiences? That's what I was sort of asking myself when I was looking into these. These case studies give insights in terms of teaching practices and scaffolding techniques that support bilingual experiences. Others supported multilingual engagements that transcend dichotomies of bilingualism. Others were interested in building capacity within the institution. Some others talks about like organizational commitment. So they had different levels of commitment to this idea of language. I had the opportunity to talk and interview with some of our colleagues, both in some of these institutions, for instance, at the Field Museum, with both the Director of Education and Design Director, and they were talking about how the museum is creating accessibility and language as part of our organizational commitment to access and inclusion, and also an effort to include all of this in temporary exhibitions. The National Museum of Mexican Art is not an institution, but they are also deeply committed to giving bilingual experiences to their community. They also talked about the differences that happen throughout the years. For instance, 10 years ago, the need for bilingual experiences was more related to just access, like people understanding the content, and today is more about empowerment and redirecting younger generations to their heritage and legacy. And well, of course, within the learning and public engagement, there's already efforts and programs that are being developed that sustain these ideas of bilingualism. For instance, our partnerships with civic entities such as the Chicago Public Schools, Chicago Public Libraries, Chicago Park District, recruiting strategies for summer interns. So there's like a preference in having bilingual interns coming in so that we can develop these types of approaches, development of art plus language school tours, Journey Maker, and other interpretation projects with cultural specific topics. They're most of all temporary exhibitions. So looking into these practices and case studies, I went through a set of recommendations to support bilingual visitors are thinking about developing these practices. And these techniques are thought to be essentially adaptable, flexible. They're considering the abilities and existing skills of our staff. And because it's a reality that not all educators or facilitators are going to be bilingual, so how can we give them the tools to feel comfortable with these audiences? So they can be adapted to only English speaking, to bilingual, to co-teaching scenarios, etc. So the first one is getting ready. It's important to bring awareness of the dominance of English-only ideologies that visitors might come into the museum. So even if the facilitator is able to or not fully engage in both languages, just the acknowledgement of this is a great first step. And then, of course, assessing the internal capacity of the museum to see if we can offer anything for the people coming in. Then the bilingual experience. So this experience can be facilitated both by a co-teaching strategy or just like bilingual facilitators. The co-teaching, it's a Spanish-speaking and English-speaking counterpart. So the point is to give like open-ended questions and other methods in which both can be collaborating, and it aims to bring forward a non-hierarchical framework for meaning making. So also, although it's hard to keep a balance of like 50-50 between languages, it's something that we aim, and also trying to avoid translation, since this often puts one language in the service of another. And brings us back to this power structure. So prioritizing code switching and being more flexible with language just in general. And if we have bilingual facilitator having this dynamic bilingualism of going back and forth between languages. And engagement strategies. So if you know that people that don't speak both languages are not going to be understanding the whole time what you're saying, it's important to bring in activities that engage in alternative ways, as for instance doing or looking. So having some didactics, having some texts, having even art making activities that can help people still be engaged even though they're not totally understanding the text. Of course, some questions about scaffolding techniques is, first of all, trying to use the language of others as a scaffold for meaning making. So for instance, some questions would be, how would you say that in Spanish? Or how do you feel about how it's said in English? Or just doing some sort of questions that actually bring up the other person's language as well. Also using didactics and text can be a really good entry point. Yeah. So of course, language without words. So go back to the artwork, really understand that the artwork is not only supplemental, but it's actually the thing we're teaching with. So it should be like your greatest ally. And of course, embodied learning. So the museum is a physical experiences, both mind and body, so acknowledge the relationship between bodies. And for instance, also, I forgot to say earlier, but this also scaffolding activities might be activities in pairs or in groups where people can interact with like-minded folks, and they can be dealing with their family and not necessarily with the whole group in a language they don't necessarily understand. In addition to these recommendations for practice, as mentioned before, it is also important to think about language diversity and inclusion as an organizational commitment. And although that might require another discussion overall, some general thoughts on how to start thinking about these include staff awareness, assessing capacity within the institution, for instance, asking who in the museum already speaks the language. Think about possible audience research projects to set visitor expectations, enhance bilingual marketing not only for international audiences but also for local audiences, and in conjunction think about potential partnerships to enhance both community outreach and engagement. As final reflections, first, I would like to think about the importance of acknowledging language expressed and how it's expressed in intergenerational dynamics. Both the Children's Discovery Museum in San Jose and the National Museum of Mexican Art in Chicago have identified that also the use and representation of language transforms throughout time. And sometimes it's about access, sometimes it's about acknowledging heritage and diversity. Oftentimes it's about both, however the priorities fluctuate. And ultimately, it is usually about allowing adults to access the content freely and giving adults and or children the opportunity to choose how they want to engage, rather than having to translate all the time to the members of their group. However, the interaction of language moves beyond intergenerational and family spaces into a much more complex social-political sphere, and that also plays out at the museum. So among Spanish-speaking communities alone, the complexity of these relations is super complicated. It depends on country of origin, immigration stories, race, class, and much more. So language as a social practice is indeed embedded in social-cultural context in which we participate, reflect, and understand our world. Therefore, the question is, how does museums feed into the larger society and help either replicate or challenge these practices? A museum's commitment to engaging linguistically diverse groups can deepen the institution's own practice and understanding of its communities. Acknowledging diversity of languages is empowering the voice of non-English speakers and creating space for resignifying the processes of meaning making. It's a principle of shared authority. If museums aim to move forward with decolonizing their institutions, language is another layer of the endeavor ahead. Um, so decolonizing the museum is about rethinking the collection as much as thinking about giving space to diversity and the voice of visitors. An article by Lisa Schoenberg talking about the challenges of decolonizing institution. The author talks about the different perspectives of it. It's about decision-making, leadership, collections, audiences, narratives, language, and language as a decolonizing tool and process that is also a political act. In this regard, I've encountered the question on how to make the collection relevant to the communities we're engaging. Of course, that bringing forward artists and stories whose living experiences might align with those of immigrant communities or visitors might be a good way to guide the conversations and to create connections among life stories. Nonetheless, I don't think this should be the only stories to share. So collections such as the AACs, for instance, allow us to create experiences that cross borders and move among cultures. I found that the team program in the Whitney Museum presented a very interesting perspective for thinking about introducing immigrant communities to American culture. Finally, including language in the framework of accessibility and inclusion makes it aligned with the values and ideas of universal design. Therefore, acknowledging that language diversity will ultimately enhance the experience for all, like only English speakers, bilinguals, and even multilingual visitors. The museum, as a civic institution, should be ultimately committed to constantly creating a sense of belonging, ownership, and empathy. Language, as a tool of representation, has the potential to create spaces where cultural identities can be fluent, visible, and enhanced. Language is about choice, voice, and ownership. It's about building empathy and performing it freely. Um, so that's all. Thank you so much for listening, and I look forward to connecting with you. Please reach out if you have any questions, thoughts, or just wanting to share experiences of your own. Thank you.